you talked about in your book about guilt and about growing up feeling like, and I do think a lot of Christians struggle with this. I just made a video about this. I think a lot of Christians feel like God's mad at them, like
Mhm.
he's just waiting to smite them. I think a lot of Christians feel like they're still like they're under God's wrath.
Yeah,
When you're a child of God, you're not under his wrath.
that's right.
But it's almost like in some ways, whether we've been taught it at church or whatever, we sort of imbibe that, and then we feel like it's I think it's difficult well, I hate the word balance because balance isn't always the goal. The truth is the goal, but I think a lot of Christians maybe struggle with this idea of I am a sinner. I do have a sin nature. But that doesn't mean I'm worthless, right? Because
Mhm.
we also have to balance that with the doctrine of the Imago Dei, that we were made in the image and likeness of God. And I think when I observe progressive Christianity and maybe overcorrections on the other side, what you often see is people not being able to hold those two things together. Talk about the guilt that you went through as a child, because I I felt a lot of guilt. I always felt like God was mad at me. I always felt like I wasn't doing enough, like I wasn't good enough.
Mhm.
And you mentioned that being sort of one of those sticking points for you.
Yeah, the legalism of the church I grew up in, whether they said it from stage or not, I don't remember, but I had that same feeling that God's disappointed in me just constantly, even after becoming a believer. Just sort of had that. I mean, I've had to uh, unlearn that, and
Mhm.
if I'm not careful, I can sort of be subconsciously trying to earn God's favor again. It's like I don't believe that He's disappointed in me anymore, but it's like I'm doing all these things,
Mhm.
like, "You proud of me, dad?"
Yeah, right.
And, like, kinda approaching it from that viewpoint, but, yeah, I was just, as a teenager, struggling with pornography. I wrote about that in the book, and I was just in that cycle of continuing to sin, and it was like I was continually sorry, and I would say I was sorry,
Yeah.
and I wasn't gonna do it again, then I would do it again, and, I lived my life like that for a while, and there would be periods where I wasn't acting out and using that, and then there would be periods where I'd go back to that, but it was actually my wife getting sober from alcoholism, when I realized that it was more than just like a struggle with sin. It was actually a full-blown addiction that I had, and I realized it in a backwards way. A lot of people, they come to, an anonymous group or Celebrate Recovery with their surface level sin struggle, and then they realize as they're there that they have, like, control issues
Mm.
or, like, an image issue or something like that, but I realized in the reverse order, 'cause my wife was really struggling with my control, which I didn't know that I had, and, she was worried that she was gonna act out and lose her sobriety with alcohol 'cause I was so controlling as a husband, and I was like, "Dang, I had no idea," and I'm like, "Well, yeah, I've always had trouble with pornography, maybe I have an addiction there." So I went to recovery and learned that there are steps you can take and, like, systems you can put in place so that when you do sin, you don't have to sit there in that guilt
Mm.
anymore, right? Because I think we are saints. That's what the Bible says that we are now. We're co-heirs with Christ.
Yeah.
But I still struggle with sin. I don't know about you.
Yes, I do.
We all do. And
Yeah.
it's like there's a new process now for me that when I do slip up, I confess to the Lord, but I also confess to a brother or sponsor of mine. And I get back up and walk and I get back up and believe the gospel again. And I think that's what I was really struggling with when I was younger was the gospel can't be true for me if I'm still struggling with the same sin.
Right. Yeah.
It wasn't big enough to cover me. Like it was big enough to cover all the sins that I had committed, but what about the ones I was going to commit after I became a Christian? Did it
Yeah.
cover those? Did it cover the ones that I said I was sorry for, but knew I was probably going to do it again? Um, the answer is yes. And learning to stand up in freedom
Mhm.
and to really believe the gospel is true is just an amazing thing for me, but it was hard to learn that, and I can still sometimes, like I said, go back there and be like, "I'm trying to please the Lord, I'm trying to white knuckle," as they say, like,
Yeah,
hold
yeah.
everything together so tight that, I just behave exactly how God would be proud of me. He's like, "That's not even what it's about, the metric is so far above what you could ever get
Right,
to.
right.
That's why Jesus died."
Yeah, yeah.
And guess what? His blood is so, it covers everything. It
Yeah.
covers it all, so yeah,
Yeah.
that was a big deal for me.
I think what you're articulating is something that I do see with a lot of progressive Christians in the books that I read of theirs and, in their podcasts they'll talk about where it's like there's this sense of guilt and struggle over sin. And then it's almost like this overcorrection of feeling like, well, I'm just going to cast off all moral restraint
Mhm,
because what would make them feel most free in the meantime. And freedom is an interesting thing because it's multi-directional. Like when we've talked about this on the podcast before, where when Christ sets you free, I took a soteriology class, or I audited one from a seminary, and I loved this professor because he was talking about freedom, and he's like, Christians think that when you're set free, it's like you're just free to whatever. Like that's not what that's about. Like in the context of first century Roman Empire, like slaves, when you would be a bondservant to someone, so really what the gospel does is set you free from sin. Like you were a slave to sin, now you're a slave to Christ. It's not like you're free from your slavery to sin just to kind of now do whatever you want.
mhm,
You're actually become a slave now to righteousness, a slave to Christ. And so
yeah,
I think this is a tough thing for a lot of Christians. It took me many, many years and but honest, like, I don't have it all figured out as far as how that works, that I don't live this out perfectly. But it's like some Christians, I think there's this tendency to overcorrect and go into moralism, which is, I think, how you
yeah,
grew up.
yep.
And then the other extreme would be to just cast off all moral restraint and be like, well, I'm forgiven and whatever. I'm just not going to struggle anymore.
Yeah, that's such a good that's where I
Yeah.
went in progressivism.
Yeah.
When I got into that, this was before recovery and realizing I had an addiction there, is that I felt like the guilt was gone, and it was like there was this hermeneutic that I believed, about God that wasn't correct. It was, God knows my heart. So
Mhm.
it's like, if I slipped up, God knows my heart. He knows I had good intentions. But that turned into me just not keeping tabs
Mm.
on holiness. Like, we have to pursue being holy. You have I could say, God, I'm sorry that I slipped up over and over and over again, but pursuing holiness for me looked like going to Celebrate Recovery, going to an anonymous group, getting a sponsor, checking in
Mm.
every single week. These are the thoughts that's going through my brain. These are the areas that I've slipped up in. These areas I've had victory in. That is pursuing holiness. When I was progressive, I was just guilt free and I wasn't pursuing holiness.
Right.
I was just sinning whenever it happened, like no defense
Mhm.
against anything and just slipping into sin over and over again, being like, it's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
God forgives me. But that actually led, the further I got into it, it led down the road of, well, I'm just a human being. God made me like this. And so he knows I'm going to make mistakes. I wouldn't have called it sin anymore. I make mistakes or I do things that are not good for me, you know?
Mhm.
And that led me down this pathway of wondering why Jesus had to die.
Yeah.
If I'm not like an inherently bad person anymore in my mind, why is Jesus dying? Is he trying to atone? What's he atoning for? Did he have to atone for anything? I'm just a good person.
Mhm.
Everybody's just a good person on the inside. So why did he have to die? And I really didn't know towards the end of my progressive journey there.